I had wanted this for years. The cabin in the woods, the silence, the deliberate smallness of a life stripped down to what actually mattered. When remote work finally made it possible, and when the housing market made everywhere else feel like a trap, I made the decision quickly and without regret. I sold almost everything I owned. The move itself took less than an afternoon. And when I arrived at the cabin for the first time as its owner, standing in the early evening light with the forest pushing up against the tree line on all sides, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: possibility. That feeling lasted approximately until sunset, when Chandler appeared. He came from the direction of the trees, walking with the casual confidence of someone returning to familiar territory. He was around 40, unremarkable in appearance, medium height, plain features, the kind of face that wouldn't hold your memory for long. But he smiled with the wattage of someone performing friendliness rather than feeling it. All warmth, no heat. He introduced himself as a neighbor, said he had a cabin about a mile down one of the trails, said he'd seen me arrive and wanted to welcome me to the area. We talked for 15 minutes on my porch. He was pleasant enough, if slightly too insistent about pleasantness, if that makes sense. Like a salesman who has been told that likability is a tool. When I agreed, perhaps too easily, to show him around the inside of the cabin, he moved through each small room with a particular kind of attention, less curious, in retrospect, than cataloging. By the time we'd finished the short tour, the sun was down. I stood by the door. He sat on my couch. The etiquette of departure seemed not to apply to him. I had to say it aloud: it was getting late, he should probably head home. He smiled and apologized and left without visible offense, walking off the porch and into the dark without any visible vehicle. I watched him disappear into the tree line and told myself I was overreacting. I built a fire, stretched out on the couch, and let the quiet of the forest settle over me. It was extraordinary, that quiet. Just the fireplace and the dark and the sound of my own breathing. I fell asleep without meaning to. When I woke, the fire had burned lower but not out, 2 hours, maybe. The cabin had gone fully dark around the remaining glow. I got up to get water from the kitchen. And then I heard something outside. Close. Just beyond the front door. A shuffling. Low and brief, the sound of weight being redistributed on wooden boards. I went still. Listened for a full minute. Nothing further. I went to the door and moved the small curtain aside. Chandler was standing on my porch. He startled when our eyes met through the glass, and I startled in answer, and for a single disorienting moment it looked almost symmetrical, two people surprising each other in the dark. But the symmetry collapsed immediately. He was the one who had come back. He was the one who had been standing at my door in the dark without knocking, for a duration I could not know. He laughed and said he had been just about to knock, and the lie was so transparent that hearing it out loud was almost insulting. I asked what he was doing back here. I said it was late. I looked past him into the dark and noted, again, that he had no vehicle. He wanted me to come to his campfire, he said. Down the trail. Just a mile. I looked at the trail. It was a slot of absolute blackness between the trees. The forest at night in that area admitted no light whatsoever, not from stars, not from anything. He was asking me to follow him into that. I said no. I asked where his cabin was, specifically, because I wanted coordinates, wanted to understand how close he was to me. He pointed down that black trail and said a mile. I said no thank you. I said I wanted to be alone for a few days and appreciated the gesture. He kept smiling. His eyes moved past me to the fireplace. He suggested they just stay here, since I already had a fire going. Something shifted then. This was no longer the vaguely uncomfortable persistence of an overeager neighbor. This was something deliberate. Something that had a shape to it. I said no. I said it once, in a voice that meant it, and closed the curtain. Through the thin fabric I could see his outline on the other side of the door, unmoving. He stood there for longer than was reasonable, longer than any normal social exit requires, and then finally stepped off the porch and walked toward the tree line. I watched until he disappeared. Then I stood in my kitchen with a glass of water and tried to understand what had just happened. The fire crackled behind me. The forest was silent. I was alone in a cabin a long drive from the nearest town, with a door that had no peephole, and a man I didn't know had just tried twice in one night to get me to follow him outside. The gunshot answered what I hadn't yet finished asking. It split the night open, a single crack that resonated through the whole forest and left the silence afterward feeling somehow different, thinner. It came from the direction Chandler had walked. Right along the trail. I was at the door before I understood I'd moved. I opened it and looked out. Chandler came out of the trees at a dead sprint, screaming for help. He crossed the distance between the forest and my cabin in seconds. In the dark he was nearly on my doorstep before I fully registered him, and he ran straight past me through the open door before I had time to step back or respond or think. No one followed him from the trees. The forest was dark and still and empty. I turned. He was hunched in my hallway, one hand pressed to his side, telling me he'd been shot. His shirt was lifted by the way he was leaning, and there, at his hip, was the handle of a revolver. Silver. Compact. The grip of a gun he had been carrying the entire time. Every smile, every overeager handshake, every persistent invitation, all of it done with a loaded weapon at his waist. I don't know exactly what the mind does in moments like that. It doesn't think in sentences. It processes in images and decisions. What I know is that in one motion I had my car key, and in the next I was through the door and running. He called my name twice. He didn't try to stop me. I drove with 911 on the speaker and didn't stop until I was far enough from those trees to breathe. The officer who went to the cabin found Chandler exactly where I'd left him, sitting in my living room chair, apparently content to wait. He was cuffed and questioned and said very little. What the subsequent investigation found was this: there was no cabin down that trail. There was no cabin at all. He had no address anywhere in the area, or anywhere they could find. His name appeared to be false. And his revolver, they confirmed, was loaded but missing one round. He had fired it himself, somewhere in those trees. To create a crisis. To give himself a reason to come running back to my door. Because a man bleeding and terrified and asking for help is much harder to turn away than a man asking you to come follow him into the dark. I think about the two versions of that night often. The version where I followed him down the trail, and the version where I got in my car. They are separated by one moment of instinct and nothing else. The gun was always there. The plan, whatever it was always there. The forest and the darkness were always there, waiting. I was new. I was alone. I had just, that very day, told someone exactly how the cabin was laid out. The quiet I had dreamed of in that place turned out to be real. Only the dream had been wrong about what kind of quiet it was.